This project is driven by my personal interest in navigating my cultural upbringing and my Chinese-Canadian identity. Here are some theaters and troupes that I'll be talking about today. In particular, I aim to investigate and understand the role of Cantonese opera in Vancouver's Chinatown community during the 1920s. I argue that Cantonese opera and theater significantly contributed to the formation and sustaining of a thriving Vancouver Chinatown community during the decade. I'll begin my research by systematically reviewing a Chinese newspaper published in Vancouver titled The Chinese Times. It was published every day except for Sundays from 1914 to 1992 and documented Vancouver local news and entertainment, Canadian news and politics, Chinese and global news. My methodology is influenced by Dr. Nancy Rao's 2020 Li Xuefang meets Mei Lanfang article, where she closely examines a Shanghai newspaper titled Shenbao to trace two-star opera performers meeting, Cantonese opera's popularity in Shanghai, and similarities between the genres San Francisco and Shanghai migration. I use the same methodology to review the 1920s decade of Chinese times for investigating the Cantonese community's everyday experience in Vancouver and how Cantonese opera music played a central role in the establishment and development of a prosperous community. Reading Chinese Times was the most obvious choice for investigating this topic in its Vancouver context. Dr. Nancy Rao, for one, had already mentioned the newspaper in her 2017 book titled Chinatown Opera Theater in North America. But to this day, no one has reviewed this newspaper methodically. And another important reason is that the Chinese Times has recently been published and digitized by SFU systematically. So far, I've looked into 8 years of the 1920s decade, from and including the year 1920 to 1927. I chose to review this decade precisely because this was the time period when the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act was proposed and passed. From the newspaper, we see that Vancouver's Chinatown community was very well organized, self-sufficient, and financially comfortable during the 1920s. This is evidenced by the various advertisements posted by multiple Cantonese opera theaters, as well as numerous reports on Vancouver's Chinatown community supporting fellow Chinese communities elsewhere, including those in China, Honolulu, and Japan. We see a trend where theaters such as Singping Theater and Lokmaning Theater regularly posted advertisements using theater names, and from 1920, but from 1920 onwards began to post advertisements using troupe names such as Dokmangon Troupe, as well as Gokdongheng Troupe. Such shift in emphasis from location to performers indicate a heightened focus on Cantonese opera performers' disassociation with particular locations and their mobility from one town to the next. There was often head-on competition between theaters as well. From September 8, 1921 to January 25, 1922, for instance, both Singping Theater and Lokmaning Theater advertised side by side. Despite intense competition, however, theaters sometimes collaborated to further their charity efforts in helping Chinese communities. In January of 1922, for instance, Singping Theater and Lokmaning Theater cooperated to put on performances and raise funds for the operations of a public Chinese school in Vancouver. Indeed, we see many instances of Cantonese opera theaters supporting fellow Chinese communities on both a local and global scale. In February of 1923, for instance, Lokmaning Theater put on performances to raise funds for challenging a proposed law that aimed to segregate Caucasian and Chinese students in Vancouver and Victoria public education. In May of 1923 as well, Singping Theater organized performances to raise lawyer fees and support the Anti-Chinese Immigration Protest Committee in preventing the Chinese Immigration Act from being passed nationally. Despite the community's ultimate failure to stop the Laws Act enactment on July 1, 1923, Chinatown theaters continued to raise funds to confront various anti-Chinese and anti-Asian laws in subsequent years. We also see that the Chinatown Theater's charity efforts were not confined by national borders. There were numerous instances of theaters holding performances to support fellow Chinese communities outside of Canada. On September 28, 1923, for instance, Sokmanon Troupe was raising funds for Chinese residents in the aftermath of a Japanese earthquake. In October of 1924 as well, Singping Theater put on performances for flooding relief in northern China. It is evident from the Chinese Times that Cantonese opera theaters in Vancouver and Victoria periodically put on performances not for profit, but for the sole purpose of benefiting Chinese communities in Vancouver, Japan, and Mandarin-speaking northern China. Such kind of non-commercial, community-based performance significantly contributed to a sense of unity and solidarity, both within and beyond the local Vancouver Chinatown community. Based on my evidence, Vancouver's Chinatown community was very well structured, self-sustaining, and financially thriving. Unfortunately, union groups, along with the Canadian government, began to develop negative sentiments toward the Chinese during this decade. Seen as taking away Caucasian jobs, Chinese and Japanese in Canada in the 1920s encountered rampant discrimination and oppression in their everyday lives. One can clearly perceive the widespread racialized tension between Caucasians and Asians in British Columbia upon reading the early 1920s of Chinese Times. In particular, the former group felt uneasy and threatened, which developed into open animosity and structural racism upon realizing that the small Chinatown communities in Vancouver and Victoria have grown to be very resourceful enough to simultaneously sustain multiple Cantonese opera theaters and financially support the publishing of a daily newspaper, as well as actively mobilize to help local and transnational Chinese communities. Yet, the Cantonese community was not politically powerful enough to disrupt the implementation of the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act. My findings indicate that it was precisely because Chinese communities in Canada have become so self-sustainable, coordinated, and united that local Caucasian groups lobbied the Canadian government to pass anti-Asian immigration laws, such as the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, to stop virtually all Chinese immigration. The point of my research is not to blame the Canadian government for their past racial prejudice or acts of racism, nor is it to absolve politicized unions such as the Import Customs Business Committee and Farmers Committee from historically oppressing and banishing minority groups. Rather, by showing that Chinese communities were flourishing despite such a long history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, I argue that Cantonese music and theaters played an indispensable role in Chinese community formation in British Columbia up during the 1920s. Ultimately, anti-Asian and anti-Chinese racism remains ongoing today. While the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified anti-Asian racial tensions in Canada and around the world, the Chinese Times reveals to us that racism has had a long history here in Vancouver. To this day, there continues to be stark differences between my immigrant family's everyday experience and my daily experience as a Chinese Canadian who is fluent in English. With this research, I hope to shine a new light on the Chinese community's resilience, strength, and unity both a century ago and today. At the end here, I would also like to thank and acknowledge all those who have supported me during this research process. Thank you.